Okay, recordings are going and the projector is just almost bright enough for everybody to see. So we will jump in right where we left off. Well, actually, we're going to start with a little bit of review. I hope these reviews are helpful to you. I know this is a lot of information. One of the things about studying this book, as well as certain other books that are lesser known or lesser understood or more challenging, and by the way, please, if you missed this in any of the previous lessons, I in no way want to communicate that this is an easy book. It's difficult. I know I talked to one of the church members and they said, I don't know, it's still a hard book to me. Well, it is. It's only the most contested book in all of church history as far as its interpretation and reading. So don't be turned down or turned off or discouraged because we have to put some work into it. But let's see if it won't be a bit less mysterious. All right, review time. The questions are a little bit harder this week, by the way, because you've been just so quick to answer them. So hopefully this won't discourage you from speaking up. But given the literary genre, or if you're Canadian, genre, what things should we keep in mind when reading Revelation? So this is not just a read from your notes. This is applying your notes from previous lesson. Given the literary genre, which we said was apocalyptic, how should we expect to read this?
As dream sentences, not necessarily perspective.
Right. Right. So, if you're reading it and you're saying, whoa, this is difficult because these are all strange things, it's supposed to be strange things. Again, I ask you, how many of your dreams make a whole lot of sense when you wake up? Or, better yet, when you tell your dreams to somebody else, do they make sense? Because sometimes they make sense to us and no one else. All right, so it's symbolism. It's not Polaroid of heaven necessarily, right? It's symbolism. It should be different. Refresh your memory, the one guy who read it and said it was science fiction. It's supposed to come off that way. All right, so what is recapitulation or parallelism, and where else do we find it in the Bible? Hard questions tonight. There you go. So, it is in the Old and the New Testament. So I'm going to present when we actually get to the text very shortly. If you recall back to the outline, I'm going to present that there are 7 recapitulations or 7 sequences of visions, and they retell not the same details, but they're about the same periods of time rather than reading it in a linear fashion. And you're right, we do find that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, because we learn best by repetition a lot of times. One of the clearest pictures of that, of course, I used in the previous lesson was the 4 Gospels, right? 4 books. They all tell about the same story, but they tell it differently. All right? Why should we not read the numbers in Revelation as literal?
They were symbolic.
That's the easy answer, right?
That's right. That's what you said.
So, given that we're reading a book where we say that this is expected to be symbolism, it would be unexpected, unless there's something in the text to point us to it, to say this is symbol, this is symbol, this is symbol, but this has to be literal, right? That's a strange way to read something like this. That's a strange way to read this type of literature. We don't get to pick and choose what we want to say is literal or figurative. We have to take those cues from the text. And I'm saying there's nothing from the text to make us stop in the middle or at various points through and say we should stop reading it as the apocalyptic literature that it is. What should we make of the use of Old Testament language in Revelation? Oh, I guess first we need to remember that there is a lot of it, so we should look at it. But knowing that much of the language is taken from the Old Testament, how should that help us read the Revelation?
Find references.
Yeah. So if this has been used before, what did it mean there? Right? And given there's so much language in the Revelation from the Old Testament, one of the best study guides, if, of course, our Bibles are usually bound together. I doubt many of you have an Old Testament bound and a New Testament bound. But if you did have that, it would be helpful to keep the Old Testament open over here while you read the New Testament, or the Revelation especially. That is true outside of Revelation, but certainly true in Revelation. All right, so here's a challenge question, putting some of this together. And this comes from a couple discussions I've had with a couple different folks outside of our sessions here. Should we read the Revelation for a surface reading, meaning it's okay to read and not understand all the symbols? What do you think? This hasn't been covered. This is just a challenge question. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we will get more from it. He's guessing and getting them right, y'all. That means you can guess and get,
How am I going to say anything?
on a yes or no question, you got a 50-50 shot. And if you say it, well, I guess you can't say yes and no that sounds the same. But anyways, maybe would be a safe answer.
I think I can.
Oh, well, he could. Okay. Yeah, so it is absolutely okay. And remember, at the beginning I said I want to make this book accessible. And one of the reasons people don't read the Revelation is because they're afraid of it, because they don't know what it means. Cool. Read it anyways. Because A, you might figure out stuff while you're reading through it. God has a way of illumining your mind if you prayerfully read His Word. But also, guess what? This book is not just a book about symbols that we have to decode. There are storylines in it, right? There are narratives within it. There's a sort of meta-narrative, I suppose, an overarching. But there's also individual. And so if you're reading this and you say, even if you say, well, I don't really know what any of these things mean, but I can see here that there's this conflict raging. I can see here that there's evil portrayed and that there's going to be divine judgment and there's going to be divine victory. Guess what? You've gotten a big part of the meaning of the book. Okay? It's good to read the surface reading. Now, it's not good to read the surface and say we don't need anything else, but it's good to just read the surface reading. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'm going to ask you, and try not to think about how you make your faces. How many of you have answered the challenge of sitting down and reading the entire Revelation in one sitting? If you haven't done it yet, still plenty of time. We haven't even started the study of chapter 1 yet, all right? How many of you have listened to it? Still plenty of time, and that challenge still exists. And it's okay. In fact, it's wonderful, because if we waited till we understood all of it before we read it or listened to it, I would not have read or listened to it yet, because I don't know everything there is to know about it. Yes?
Well, I was thinking you said it repeats itself, so if you're just reading it and don't understand it, by the time you read it second or third time, it might begin to make sense to you.
If not, yes. Some of it will. Some of the reason I challenge you to read it all together is some of that. What?
He said I was wrong.
Oh.
It didn't get much to
It hasn't worked for me.
It hasn't worked yet? All right.
me either.
All right, I'm not promising osmosis. Like if you go to sleep with your Bible open to the Revelation under your pillow, it doesn't just seep in. But you can get the themes. You can get the big picture. You cannot know what any of this is and read the book and figure out that Jesus wins and the devil loses. That's one of the great storylines, all right? That's an important one. You've heard the preachers say, probably heard me say, I've read the end of the book and we win. You can get that without understanding all the symbolism. So do read it, and hopefully these studies will help you to understand more of it. But don't wait till you understand it to read it. All right. We've been working through all of our introductory material. We've worked through most of the themes. Tonight's handout, number 6, has the theme of Joshua and John's Gospel. Tonight's paper has the least amount of room for you to write on. I apologize if you're a big note taker. Use the back, use the margins, use wherever you want. There's just some stuff I wanted to put in front of you so that you didn't have to scroll down all the scripture references, etc. So we'll get through that. I think we'll get through Joshua and John's Gospel if I get on with the lesson tonight. We'll see. Joshua and Jesus. again, this is one of the themes that we will help us to understand what the Revelation is about. So much has been said and much has been written over the years about the names Joshua and Jesus. I can summarize it all in saying, essentially, they're the same name. Okay? The Hebrew alliteration, meaning if you listen to the Hebrew pronunciation, it sounds more like Joshua. But if you listen to the Greek, it sounds more like the English Jesus. And as a matter of fact, that parallel or that intersection becomes more clear when we look at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is what Jesus and the apostles largely quoted from. So I have a couple lines for you up on the screen here. Don't care that doesn't jump out. Is there anybody in here who does read? Doesn't matter if there isn't. You're going to be able to pick this out. The first one is from Exodus chapter 17, verse 10. All right, you see the Greek on the board. The English says, "So Joshua did as Moses told him." All right. You'll rarely hear me say this, but for the purposes of this illustration, I don't want you searching for the larger context. Just look at the words to make the point. All right, so Joshua did as Moses told him. The second is Matthew chapter 1, verse 16, an excerpt from that verse, which says, "Of whom Jesus was born." Now, look there. Even if you cannot read this foreign language, and you can accuse me of projecting in tongues, if not speaking in tongues tonight, look at the circled and highlighted portions. The third word from the Exodus and the fourth word in the New Testament from Matthew. Same word. Our English translations translate Exodus 17:10 as Joshua, and we know Joshua. Our English Bibles translate Matthew chapter 1, verse 16 as Jesus. All right? Now, I'm having to point this out because it doesn't jump out at us. What I'm trying to get across in this is the original hearers and readers of the Revelation would have heard the same name. They would have made this connection right off, right? We're separated by culture, by 2,000 years, and by a language. They would have understood this name is the same. So why is that significant? At a high level, listen to this storyline. A great and wicked city is being destroyed by God in order for His people to inherit their right reward as divinely promised. There is shouting and the blast of trumpets at the sudden destruction of the city, and the attack is led by Joshua. And where's that story from? Battle of Jericho. It's also the storyline of the Revelation. The New Testament, the first century New Testament hearers of the Revelation would have picked up on this parallel. This is a retelling of Jericho, but Jesus instead of Joshua, or Joshua instead of Joshua. You see, they're the same name. So let's look at, well, I don't have it on the slide. Look at your handouts, and you'll see these references. All right? Let's do this. I'm just going to call out. We're not going to read all these verses. We don't have all that much time. I'm just going to call out what happens, or you can read what happens there on the left hand, or the Old Testament, or the Joshua column. I want you to open your Bibles. All right? Some of you open to John chapter 1. Somebody open to Ephesians 2. Somebody open to John chapter 8. Somebody to Revelation 18, Revelation 8. And we'll trust that not everybody goes to the same place. All right, so we're going to need John 1, Ephesians 2, John 8, Revelation 8, Revelation 18. And what I'm going to put across to you is that this narrative parallels the Battle of Jericho, and it's found in the Revelation, and that's going to lead us to help us to understand what the Revelation is truly about. All right. So I'll call out the left hand, or the Old Testament column. Joshua chapter 1. Joshua is the successor to Moses. You recall Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of bondage, through the great wandering period, but he was not himself allowed to enter into the land of promise. God took him up on the side of the mountain, and he saw, but he did not physically enter into the promised land. Instead, Joshua was called. And Joshua led the people. And in fact, we read, if you look even just at the table of contents of your Bible, you find then the book of Joshua, right? He succeeds Moses. Now, someone read John chapter 1, verse 17.
For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Jesus is pictured in the New Testament. So this is not something we're making up to fit it into this mold. Jesus is pictured in the New Testament as the successor to Moses. As a matter of fact, there's a dramatic retelling. Moses is one of the things he's most known for, whether you're talking about the Charlton Heston version or the more accurate biblical version. He's known for going up into the mountain and meeting God and bringing back the tablets, the law, right? At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he goes up on the side of a mountain and he delivers a message, right? Starts in Matthew, early part of Matthew, was it chapter 5 and 6 and 7? From that we get the Beatitudes. From that we get that great sermon from the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount, as it's commonly called, right? He's pictured as being the successor of Moses. In fact, if we read through the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews makes a strong connection that Jesus is the successor to Moses. Moses being the mediator of the old covenant, Jesus being the mediator of the new. So, in that way, Joshua is the new and the greater Jesus. Joshua chapter 3, our second event we'll talk about. One of the first events of Joshua's ministry. Question? Oh, no. One of the first events, God proves or stamps his approval upon Joshua when he crosses the Jordan River. God's people cross across. In early Jesus ministry, John chapter 1, who wants to read for us there? 28 to 34.
These things were done in Bethabara, beyond Jordan, where John was baptized. The next day John seeth Jesus coming unto him and saith, Behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, After me cometh a man which is preferred before me, for he was before me. And I knew him not, but that he should be made manifest to Israel. Therefore am I come baptizing with water. And John bare record, saying, I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it abode on him.
All right, so John is baptizing there at the Jordan. In fact, John references there, although we don't see it spelled out, his baptism of Jesus. So again, we find this Jordan, this passing through Jordan as a beginning point of the ministry. Yes?
I had 2 more verses.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You ran out of breath and
You jumped in.
I'm ready to go. Would you like to read the other 2 verses?
That's all right. I'm done now.
Thank you. All right. So again, at least a second, and just these are to establish a pattern, right? To show that Jesus is pictured in the New Testament as the successor to Moses, as the new and greater Joshua, so to speak. All right. Joshua chapter 4. Upon his crossing the Jordan River, one of the instructions that he gave, and this is a beautiful picture, he said to take 12 stones from the river as they crossed. And as a matter of fact, they set them up on the other side, and he instructed them to build it such that when your children see these stones and they ask you, what is this for, that you're able to tell them then about the salvation of God, how that he brought us through. This great memorial that was set up by these 12 stones. And in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, we find a reference to some other great memorial that Jesus set up.
And are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone.
Right. The church is founded first upon Christ, but also upon the ministry of the 12 apostles. Jesus did not choose 12 apostles because he was feeling froggy and found 12 stones that day, or he liked the number 12. It was all a part of God's plan, and it's supposed to point us back to the Scriptures, to the Old Testament, to show the continuation, the connection with God's people of the Old Testament. 12 tribes, 12 stones, 12 apostles. And of course, as we looked at previous lesson, the number 12 always ought to show us, because God doesn't do anything by happenstance, always on purpose. Anytime we find God choosing 12 of something, He's showing us something, showing us unity. And so, once again, we find a point of connection between Joshua and between Jesus. All right, next point of intersection or correspondence. Joshua chapter 6. When Joshua leads this so-called Battle of Jericho. It's the funniest thing, by the way, to call it a battle and to sing the song that we sang growing up about Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. How did Joshua fight the Battle of Jericho? He walked, they blew horns, and they shouted. So it might be better if we sang, it may seem strange, but it might be more accurate if we sang in our VBS and Sunday schools, Joshua cheered the Battle of Jericho, right? He shouted. He did not pick up a weapon. But anyways, in this great story of the fall of Jericho, one of the big and very interesting parts of that story, as we have mentioned before, these things start overlapping, is Rahab, right? The Canaanite prostitute. I said last week, there was nothing about, if we look at the law of God, the law of Moses, there's no reason she should have been shown mercy. There's no reason she should have been included. But Joshua had mercy. When they came back and said, here's the layout, and by the way, we were hid by Rahab, he said, let her hang out the red cord, remember, at the window? And we'll know, hit everywhere but there. And it's pictured up there kind of, isn't it? It's pictured, she and her family would be saved. What about Jesus? John chapter 8, verse 11.
She said, no man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more.
There you go. Here's the woman caught in the sin of adultery, caught red-handed, which makes us wonder perhaps if those accusing her weren't setting a trap to catch her. But that aside, the question they asked Jesus, Moses said we should stone her. What do you say? Now, that's not the setup of all times, but of course, it's not a problem for Jesus. Jesus does what? He tells them those without sin cast the first stone, and it's first the eldest went away down to the youngest, and that's when we come to this verse. So Jesus shows mercy to this woman in a very similar way, or in a way that ought to cause us to remember the way that Joshua showed mercy to Rahab. All right. Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 1 describes Jericho for us. Talks about the wicked and the fortified city. How do we read about Babylon the Great? Revelation 18:5.
For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities.
That is almost a quotation from Deuteronomy 9, where it talks about the walls that reach toward the heaven. In the Revelation, as we picture Babylon, this great city, the sins have reached toward heaven. How about the conquering, right? The picture on screen. The walls falling down. I remember one of my favorite songs that the quartets used to sing about, and the walls came tumbling down, right? What happened? They were supposed to march around the city for 6 days, and then the seventh day, they march around 7 times, and then they blow the trumpets as the walls fall down. And in Revelation chapters 8 through 11, or I think that should be 8 verse 11,
Wormwood, and the third part of the waters contained wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter.
you probably read the right thing, and I put the wrong verse down. I apologize.
I wonder what that had to do with you.
Now, see, that's just because you don't understand. No, I'm just kidding.
That's probably true.
I'm totally... All right. There we go. Chapter 8, verses 8 through 11. That's how about that?
And the second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood.
I said 8. I meant 6. Forgive me. Chapter 8. I just want to hear you read a lot tonight. Try chapter 8, verse 6 and 7. We'll stop. I don't know where I got 11 from.
Are you at 8 or 6?
Chapter 8, verse 6. We'll get it right in a minute. I'm pretty sure.
And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. So that does sound right.
That does sound right. It sounds a whole lot more like Joshua chapter 6, doesn't it?
The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burned up, and all green grass was burned up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter.
All right. So the wormwood makes more sense if you start with the angel blowing the trumpet, right? So, point being, we find in the Revelation, in the overthrowing of this symbolic city, Babylon, again, a continuation of this same storyline. How that there was trumpets blowing and the walls and the city began to come. In fact, we'll read when we get there, it says that the destruction of Babylon came in a day, in an hour, which is very reminiscent of Jericho. A little side story. I was joking with a friend of mine recently, and he recommended that I filter my Bible studies through the lens of the History Channel. He was kidding, of course. And I said, you know, one of those History Channel specials I watched was about the fall of Jericho. And they had acoustical engineers trying to figure out how you could get 7 trumpets tuned to the exact right frequencies to combine and have enough amplitude where it would shake the mortar and the bricks. And I sat there going, nobody ever said that's what happened. They blew trumpets and God knocked the walls down. Thank you very much. But anyways, when you read the right verses, we find in the Revelation that there was trumpets blowing, and we find the end of Babylon. All right, one more. Joshua chapter 6, of course. They marched around, and they blew their trumpets, and they shouted, and the walls of the city fell. Revelation 18 and 10. And let's see if I got this one right.
Standing afar off with the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, the great city of Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come.
There you go. So, when we look at this narrative, remember I said at the beginning that's the reason I had that challenge question, or one of the reasons. You don't have to have all the symbolism in your mind to pick up on some of these things. When the first century readers or hearers heard this, the Revelation, or read it for themselves, they would have picked up on this. Jesus is the new and greater Joshua. All right? The book of Revelation is a revelation of, anybody remember that first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ. So when we ask ourselves, what is the subject matter of the Revelation, here's a great clue. Starts with a J. So why is that significant? And how do we put that into action or into application? So one of the terrible things that has entered into church teaching, and this is for the past few generations, is a complete separation and segregation between Old Testament and New Testament, right? And never the twain shall meet. That's not the way it is. In fact, it's very difficult to understand the New Testament not in light of the Old Testament. Especially when you think about it, and I remember the day when this struck me, and I just, if I had been driving, I would have had to pull over. This was like big light bulb over my head time. I had always had this huge wall of division, perhaps greater than the walls of Jericho, if I want to keep it tied into this lesson, between the Old and the New, until I realized all the New Testament authors were Old Testament people. Here's what I mean by that. It wasn't like they woke up one day and said, oh, everything's different. We're just going to live different. We're not going to do anything the same. We're not going to dress the same. No. It was exactly the same. In fact, if you read the book of Acts, The early church, the first church there at Jerusalem, where did they meet? At the temple. Why? Because they were Old Testament believers who were understanding that the Messiah had come. Right? There is more continuity than discontinuity. Because after all, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Even baptism has the seeds and the pictures of it in the Old Testament. Even the church has the seeds, has the DNA, has the prophecies in the Old Testament. So a big part of the New Testament is trying to explain how all those promises that God made to Israel, and He did make them, aren't just lies or broken or unfulfilled, but rather are fulfilled through Jesus and through His church. So then if we have that in mind, and we try to think as much as we can, it's very difficult, but as much as we can, try to listen or read this as a New Testament first century reader or listener, and we say, oh, Jesus is the new Joshua, who is the one who brought His people into the promised land. We see this continuing story of God continuing to be faithful and provide, and all those promises weren't so literal and immediate, but it was about what God was going to do through Jesus and through His church. Do you recall the Hebrew writer talking about the Old Testament believers? How they died without seeing the promise? And how he said, but for us, on this side of the cross, God provided something better. We have a fuller picture. We have a fuller understanding. We have a better revelation and picture of what Christ had for us. Right? So, understanding that Jesus is the new Joshua is a great clue. What is the book of the Revelation about? It's about Jesus. It's about God fulfilling His covenant promises and His salvation to His people through Jesus. Right? So that kind of knocks out, I said before, I have trouble viewing this book as only futuristic and it's only about the very last few things before Christ comes. Well, how would that have helped the first century church? It wouldn't have. If we begin to say, we need to find out how that what we see on CNN matches up with the Revelation, because clearly these things must symbolize the Russians or the Chinese or the Koreans or the Americans or whatever. How does that help the first century church who were the recipients of this letter? It doesn't. But if we read this as a continuation of God showing what He's going to do and how He's going to do it now in the church age or New Testament age, however you want to say it, well, then it starts to make sense why it would have been encouraging to the first century church, the second century church, the third century church, all the way through, and why it's still so very relevant for us in the 21st century. Because it's very relevant for us today to say Jesus is the new and greater Joshua. Right? That's why I think things like this help us so much. And it also helps us from just looking in the wrong places. Okay? Let's move on to the next. How about the correspondence, and I don't mean the writing of letters, but I mean how they correspond to each other, between the gospel that John wrote and this last book, the Apocalypse, the Revelation. All right? I have on the screen, I'll say it at the end, it's on your handouts at the bottom, I think. I'll go ahead and read it. This is sort of the thesis of this section. The preponderance of correspondences, I just couldn't resist using words like that. You got to use phrases like that sometimes, right? The preponderance of correspondences between the gospel and the apocalypse seem to indicate both that there is a unity in purpose and that they can best be understood in light of each other. What does that mean? It means there is so much of this pattern of John referring to the same things in the Gospel and the Revelation that it just makes sense that we understand them best as a pair. Not unlike, by the way, the Gospel, Luke, and Acts. They're both written by Luke, right? The book of Acts is sort of volume 2 of Luke, right? So he wrote about the gospel of Jesus and then continued on with his church, the apostles, the early church. That's how Luke did it. It's volume 1, volume 2. And I'm saying John wrote his gospel and then years later wrote the Apocalypse or the Revelation sort of as a volume 1, volume 2. Okay? They go together. And I'm going to show you a few ways that is shown in pattern. All right, let's see. For instance, in John chapter 20, verse 31, he says, "These things are written that you believe, or that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ." Right? The purpose of John's writing his gospel was that people would come to faith in Jesus. What is the purpose of the revelation? Chapter 1, verse 1. It's the revealing of Jesus. Same purpose. John says, I want to write about Jesus so that you see him and so that you realize that he is the Christ. Volume 2, I want to show you Jesus again and more fully. Unified purpose. I contend that the clues in the text bring me, and I think should bring us, to seeing that the revelation is an unveiling of the heavenly perspective of the narrative that begins in his gospel account. What I mean by that is, when you read through John's gospel, it's an eyewitness account. Right? He talks about where Jesus walked, what he said, what others said to him. It was all very horizontal, right? In the Revelation, we see the heavenly perspective to show us what's going on both in the gospel account and then further all the way to the second coming of Christ. Now, John's gospel ends, of course, Jesus being resurrected, whereas the Revelation takes the story further and includes even his second coming. John uses the language of a bride and a bridegroom starting in John chapter 2, verse 9. And he clearly identifies the groom as Jesus. But not until Revelation 21 do we hear, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." All right? So again, it's a continuation and it's the rest sort of the story. So let's look at the table that, yes, I included on your handouts. There are many tie-ins, correspondences, patterns that we find. I just wanted to show you a couple. John chapter 2. If you look at that first table on the left-hand side of your handout, the way this table is divided on the left is events in the earthly temple. Because once again, I said the events of the Gospel of John were very horizontal. And then the right-hand column is saying things that happened in the heavenly temple in the Revelation. So, for instance, in John chapter 2, verse 15, we find the first instance of where Jesus went to the temple at the time of Passover. And he was angered, if you recall, about what he found there, about the money changers and the way that they had abused the temple. All right? And he drove them all out. He made the whip and the cords, and he drove them out in his anger. Whereas, correspondingly, in Revelation 15 and 8, we find the phrase that no man was able to enter into the temple. Right?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
15 and 8 says, "Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit."
That's Revelation 15.
Yes. That should be Revelation 15 and 8. The references in the right column are Revelation. The references in the left column are John. I apologize if that was not made as clear as it should have been. Yes, that would be very confusing. All right, continuing in John chapter 2, we see Jesus talking about how they had made the temple into a house of merchandise. In the right-hand column in Revelation chapter 18, we find mentionings about the merchants of the earth and the wickedness and the selfishness and the gluttonous greed. We find that discussed and represented, if you will. On the left, verse 17 in John chapter 2 talks about how that Jesus was consumed with zeal. In Revelation 20 and 9, we find that fire consumed them, that burning zeal. You see, is a similar phrasing there. Verse on the left again, chapter 2, verse 18, they asked about what sign, what is this proof that you have authority to do this, Jesus? And we find in Revelation 15 and verse 1 that there was another sign given. Chapter 2, verses 19 and 21, Jesus refers to his own body as a temple. That's where he said, of course, if you destroy this temple, right? And we find in Revelation 21 and 22, it said that the Lamb himself, which is Jesus, is the temple. So I'm not saying that these verses necessarily line up one for one, so he's talking about the same event. What I'm saying is, John, in writing these two, Volume 1, Volume 2, if you will, he uses these literary devices, patterns, right? And so when you see enough of these patterns and knowing how God works, you begin to say, maybe God is trying to tell us something. Like, for instance, the first time we ever heard that there were 12 apostles, it should have jumped up. Oh, well, there were 12 tribes. Oh, there was all this, you see. These patterns that God has laid out for us. Now, we have to keep these all in context and be very careful, because if you really just want to force a pattern, well, there's people out there that have software programs right now that if you take the 3rd page and the 5th letter of every 6th sentence, we can find your name prophesied in the Old Testament. We don't want to do that. But we do want to keep our eyes open to what are the patterns that God has given us in the Scripture. And so, when you start looking at patterns and typology, it does sort of get kind of fuzzy, and we have to be cautious. And, I certainly would not have built an entire theology based on this table. But once you begin to see the clues, which is why I use that word preponderance of correspondences, it just sort of drives home to me the correlation. All right, let's look through this second table, and we will stop here for the night. So this is a comparison. Again, left-hand column are references in the Gospel of John, talking about the wedding in Cana. And on the right, we find scripture references from the Revelation about the wedding of the Lamb. We find there that we can line those up very interestingly. Again, I'm not saying the wedding of the Lamb is a parallel or is talking about the wedding in Cana. What I'm saying is this is a literary form or a pattern that was set for us and helps us to correspond the two. That those more literary-minded would have picked up on these perhaps, and some have. So on the left we find an invitation to the wedding. We find that when they got to the wedding in Cana, of course, as the story goes, they were out of wine. And Jesus was asked about it, and he said, "My hour is not come," in verse 4. In chapter 2, verses 4, 7, and 10, we find the woman, we find the pots that were used, and we find the drinking. And in the end, what is the resolution, or what is the conclusion of Jesus' miracle there, his first public miracle? They rejoiced, of course. It was a wedding. And Jesus provided for them there. Now, if we look at the Revelation's depiction of the wedding of the Lamb, we find these same events, or same pieces, if you will. Right? It talks about those who are invited to the wedding. They ran out of wine at Cana. We read about the wine of rage in chapter 19, verse 15. Jesus said, "My hour is not come." We hear about the hour of judgment. In chapter 17, verses 1, 2, 4, and 6, we hear about a woman. We hear about a cup being filled, and we hear about the drinking of it. And because, linking back to something I said earlier tonight, because at the end of the Revelation, whether we get all the symbolism or not, it's clear that we win, or that Jesus wins, and we share in that. Chapter 18, verse 23, there is great rejoicing. All right, so those correspondences, again, that might be a little bit kind of fuzzy, kind of hard to pin down some of those, but there are so many of them, and I've just given a couple of them, that after looking at them all, I think this once again helps us. Helps us to settle what is the subject of the Revelation. It's revealing Jesus and how he is bringing about deliverance in this age during the time of the church. So that means we can track much of the content of Revelation to the gospel account, or at least beginning there. Both internal and external evidence point most clearly to these vision sequences describing different facets of the time between the incarnation of Jesus and his imminent second return, which is yet to come. So, this is one of the last things that I say is just another support of why I believe that the Revelation is not all in the future, but it's about what began at the coming of Jesus, and it's about the life and the time that we're living now, and it extends into telling us about Jesus' second coming. Now that brings us to either the last preparatory topic or the first actual study of chapter 1. We'll talk next session about what I have termed the epistolary purpose, or in other words, that this is a letter written. So we're going to stop there. I'm 2 minutes over I said 15 to 10, which means 10. And it's 8 till, so oh, well, then I'm right on time. Yeah. All right, I'm right on time. So, I have said, and I intend to keep with the Lord's help, that we are going to not run all the way to the top of the hour. So I pause here. Again, there's been a lot of heavy stuff tonight. A lot of it is just trying to show you evidence of why I read the Revelation the way that I do, and why I think you should too. So I pause here for questions and comments. I remind you once again, Brother Otis is sitting by, ready to record any question that I'm not ready to answer tonight. So far, he has had perfect handwriting, meaning there's been blank pages. But anything at all tonight? Okay. Not to sound too gimmicky or to try to have too much of a hook, but starting with this next section, rather than just randomly referring, we'll actually be reading part of the Revelation, right? So whether that's exciting or scary, I don't know. I'll leave that to you. I think it's going to be good. I've enjoyed your presence, and although you're silent tonight, I've enjoyed your questions and comments thus far. I greatly appreciate you pointing out when I have made an omission or an error, and what can I say? You're going to find more of them, I'm sure of it. Last time, anything tonight? Thank you for your dedication. I will stop the recordings.